But before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, that the University of Western Ontario is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, the Wenawapuk, and Attawattaron peoples. These are lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. And this land, of course, continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize today as the contemporary stewards of the land. I'd also like to take a quick moment, and thank the many people who helped make this event and many of the other ones over the last 2 years possible, in particular, Becky Blue, Sydney Hall, Suzanne El Sharafa, and Matt Ward. They're all here today. And without them, the event wouldn't be possible. Nancy's asked me to be brief, so I will. I always take the lead of my editor, and as a former hack. Needs no introduction to many of you here today. Nancy Fraser is the Henry and Louis A. Loeb Professor of Philosophy and Politics at the New School for Social Research and a member of the editorial committee of New Left Review. She's trained as a philosopher, and she specializes in critical social theory and political philosophy. And I'm very pleased today that, couldn't be happier that she accepted the invitation to speak on the theme of communicating solidarity. And today's talk, Three Faces of Labor, Uncovering Hidden Ties Between Gender, Race, and Class, I'm sure will be fantastic. One other note. Now, I know at these events, people like to come and, chat with folks after, and I'm afraid we have to get Nancy to an airport. And so that means we're gonna have to scurry off after the event by 3:30 or so, but we have lots of time for questions. So I'm encouraging you now to think of your questions, and there will be a mic. And Becky, are you going to be the person with the mic? Or okay, Sydney will be the person with the mic, and Nancy will coordinate the questions when it comes time to do that. And so just a warning ahead of time. So please join me in welcoming Professor Nancy Fraser.
Thank you very, very much, James, Professor Compton, for introducing me and inviting me and hosting me. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I also want to thank the Faculty of Information and Media Studies for sponsoring the event, and especially its Dean, Lisa Henderson. And I too want to thank Becky Blue and Sydney Hall for great organizational and logistical work. So, as you can tell from the title, the concept of labor is at the center of my lecture, and maybe it has occurred to you, maybe you are worrying that a focus on labor might return us to a familiar dépassé model of critical theory that necessarily prioritizes class over gender and race. Aren't you worried that this focus might lose the hard-won insights of feminism and anti-racism? Are you worried that it might take us back to the same discredited class essentialist paradigm that some of us have worked so hard to displace? Well, if that's what you're worried about, I want to assure you that it ain't so. My answer to all of those questions and worries is no, that's not where we're going with this. In fact, my hunch is precisely the opposite. I think that a reconstructed conception of labor can establish the structural basis in capitalist society for struggles against gender and racial oppression, as well as against class exploitation, and that it can also clarify the relation among gender, race, and class and struggles around those categories. But that's not all. I suspect that a focus on labor could also promote the formation of a counter-hegemonic bloc that embraces multiple emancipatory movements, but does not hierarchize or homogenize them. God knows, dare I say, we need such a bloc today when emancipatory forces, although plentiful, are dispersed, demoralized, and badly outgunned by a new unholy alliance between corporate neoliberals and reactionary populists. This situation has been at the top of my mind in my choice to focus here on the concept of labor. I want to explore the hypothesis that a reconstructed conception of capitalist labor might be just what we need to scale up emancipatory engagement and upset the regressive apple cart. So I'm going to proceed by sketching a view of capitalist society as relying on three types of work, not just exploited labor performed by free, or as Marx would say, the doubly free workers in exchange for wages in for-profit enterprises, but also expropriated labor, unfree or dependent, coercively extracted from racialized subject populations, and finally, what I'll call domesticated labor, also known as care and social reproduction, chronically undervalued, often invisible, and constitutively gendered. By mapping the entwinement of these three faces of labor, I aim to uncover hidden ties between gender, race, and class, and with them, a possible path to a more coordinated form of emancipatory struggle. My inspiration here comes from W.E.B. Du Bois, whose Black Reconstruction, published in 1935, offered a major new interpretation of 19th century US history, that is, the history of the Civil War and the formal abolition of slavery, of post-war Reconstruction, and the subsequent, this is Du Bois's language, counter-revolution of property. Now, in Du Bois's view, this period was an historical turning point which could have established what he called an abolition democracy, but led instead, as we know, to plutocracy. Again, that's his word. What decided the outcome, he claimed, was a missed encounter between the movements of anti-slavery on the one hand and trade unionism on the other. Both, Du Bois maintained, were in fact labor movements. Whereas abolition aimed to emancipate unfree workers of color, trade unionism sought to emancipate free, white, and I guess we should add male labor. So, Du Bois said, the United States had two labor movements, separated by color and status. As things played out, they failed to recognize one another and join forces. Had they done so, he thought, they might have changed the course of US history and possibly that of much of the larger world. Du Bois's account is revelatory, I think, because it broadens our view of what counts as labor and what counts as a labor movement. His core insight was that capitalist labor assumes more than one form and precipitates more than one labor movement. In his view, free and enslaved labor were distinct but structurally imbricated aspects of one single system. Enslaved Black workers, he claimed, were the founding stones of a new industrial phase of capitalism, a new industrial phase of global capitalism. Producing cotton for North Atlantic mills in UK and US, for example, they supplied raw material for their free counterparts to work up as commodities and for industrial capital to convert into profits. Framing the whole process globally, Du Bois situated enslaved Black workers in the US South within, and I'm quoting, a dark and vast sea of human labor in China and India, the South Seas and all Africa, in the West Indies and Central America, and in the United States. He didn't mention Canada, who fortunately escaped slavery. Continuing with the quote, that great majority of mankind on whose bent and broken backs rest today the founding stones of modern industry. Today, he's writing in 1935, but we'll talk about today as well. For Du Bois, then, the relation between factory and plantation was all important. To call enslaved agricultural labor a founding stone of modern industry is to say that Black expropriation undergirds white exploitation, that the two processes are inextricably imbricated, that the fates of the two groups of workers are tied together, that neither can be emancipated without the other, that two labor movements must join forces to abolish the system that generates their perverse symbiosis. Now, this view retains all of its relevance today, I believe. As Du Bois noted, the abolition of slavery in the United States and elsewhere did not put an end to unfree labor. To this day, bonded and dependent labor continues in various guises, and it is still racially marked. Mightn't we then view the anti-racist and anti-imperialist struggles of our own time as unrecognized labor struggles? But if so, why stop there? Why not view feminist movements too as unacknowledged struggles over work in systems built on a gendered separation of paid productive labor from unpaid and underpaid care work? Isn't that division between so-called productive and so-called reproductive work just as integral to capitalist society as the one Du Bois identified between expropriated and exploited labor? And if struggles to abolish prisons and defund the police, to prevent ethnic cleansing and land grabs are at least in part labor struggles, as I'll try to argue they are, why not say the same about Me Too, which targets abuses of power in the workplace? Why not view campaigns for family leave, childcare, elder care, healthcare, housing, and pensions as struggles to prioritize activities that nurture people over those designed to rack up profits? Why not view campaigns for reproductive justice, including abortion access, as struggles over the conditions of reproductive work and over the status of those who perform it? Finally, why not view campaigns for the rights of migrants and domestic workers and for the unionization of nurses, health aides, teachers, office cleaners, cooks, servers, and laundry workers as struggles to revalue social reproductive labor and to empower those who perform it? If we looked at things in this way, then domesticated labor, as I'm calling it, would also be a founding stone of the global capitalist system, supplying the owners with labor, both exploitable and expropriable. So, extending Du Bois' argument, I propose to view capitalist societies, as I said, as relying on three analytically distinct but mutually imbricated forms of labor: exploited, expropriated, and domesticated. The relations among these, I claim, form the hidden ties among gender, race, and class. So I'm endorsing Du Bois's political point while also expanding it. Our current aim should be to grasp the relations among not two, but three labor movements, and to evaluate prospects for uniting them in an enlarged pro-working class front. I call this project Du Bois Plus One. Du Bois Plus One rests on a distinction between the concept of labor in general, if you like, and the historically specific forms that labor assumes in capitalist societies. As I understand it here, labor in general means something very simple, namely effortful social action aimed at satisfying needs. But of course, we have to immediately introduce some caveats. Neither the needs that labor addresses nor the character of the labor that addresses them are given once and for all. Rather, both develop historically, as do the societies and the habitats in which labor is situated, and as does, for that matter, the so-called human nature of those who labor. Defined in this way, labor, this labor in general idea, encompasses efforts to provision human groups with food, shelter, and tools, efforts that produce useful objects. But object-producing labor presupposes other activities which maintain natural habitats and nurture people. Those efforts also count as labor. Every human society undertakes them in one way or another, along with the making of objects. In fact, object making could not exist without work that sustains those who perform it. But of course, the converse is also true. The work of nurturance could not proceed absent food, shelter, clothing, and the tools people use to fashion them. Thus, object making too is reproductive in two different senses. It assures continuation, first, of human lives, and second, of the societies in which those lives are formed and lived. Seen this way, our tendency to distinguish productive in the sense of object-making labor from reproduction in the sense of care work is problematic. By no means a universal distinction of natural kinds, it reflects historically specific arrangements that separate those activities from one another. In fact, most societies do not assign object making and people sustaining to separate spheres. Rather, they intermingle them freely in shared social spaces, as when, for example, peasant women take their babies into the fields and suckle them while tending their crops. In many societies, too, all these labors are understood as useful and worthy. All belong to the same social universe, even when tasks are divided by age, sex, or class. Capitalist societies are different, however. What constitutes work in capitalism is employment, and that covers a relatively narrow subset of effortful, need-driven activities. Those performed to the principal benefit of owners or investors, as directed by their agents or managers in officially recognized workplaces in return for a salary or wage. Persons who are not employed in this sense are considered idle. Their efforts to feed themselves and their families don't count as work, even when those efforts nurture and replenish those who are employed. Excluding activities that create non-monetized use values, capitalist societies reserve the honorific title work for efforts that enter directly into circuits of commercial exchange. The effect is to complicate the relation between effort and need. The efforts expended by workers serve their needs only indirectly as means to get cash with which to buy means of subsistence. Their work serves employers' needs indirectly too, as means to, you guessed it, profit. Whether the commodities produced are otherwise useful is a question that does not arise from within this framework. The only question is whether enough people with cash are willing to buy them. In capitalism, then, the decisive factor is the relation of effort not to need, but to capital accumulation. That dynamic foregrounds activities that directly generate surplus value, paradigmatically, but not only, waged work for private firms. Now, certainly, that labor is no picnic. Those who perform it are exploited, paid only for their necessary labor time, while the surplus value they create accrues to the capitalist. We know all this from Marx. So the work is inherently Sisyphean. They don't accumulate, they just have to do it over and over again. It's work that is also typically stultifying, repetitive, and heteronymous, free only in the thinnest sense, which is why Marx referred to proletarians in this sense as doubly free, right? Not bound to a master, but also freed from any access to means of production and means of subsistence. So, given all of this, it's no wonder that officially recognized capitalist labor is a major site and has been a major site and stake of struggle in capitalist societies. Nevertheless, following Du Bois, I want to say that exploited labor is only the tip of the capitalist iceberg. Beneath it lie two other genres. First, what I'm calling expropriated labor, which is close to what Du Bois called dark labor. And second, what I'm calling domesticated labor, which is close to what feminists now call care work. Both are forms of shadow labor, intrinsic to capitalist societies and entangled with exploited labor, but overshadowed by it, lost in the glare of the latter's assumed normativity. To say that they lie beneath exploited labor is thus to say that they are founding stones, in Du Bois's sense, necessary conditions for exploited labor, co-original with it, and indispensable elements of the larger societal complex in which exploited labor is constituted, but systematically under-recognized and undervalued. My point then is that expropriated and domesticated labor are just as intrinsic to capitalist society as exploited labor. Combined with each other and with the latter, they form three interlocking pillars of one social system, analytically distinct, but internally related and mutually imbricated. Each face of labor has its role to play in that system, but the role of each is co-constituted in and through its relation to the others, and none can play its role without the others. Together, in other words, they form a nexus that powers capitalism's signature productivity, and we might add destructivity, while also inscribing gender, race, and class deep within it. Now let me elaborate. First, expropriated labor. This is unfree or dependent labor, unwaged or underwaged, coercively extracted from subjugated populations. In a sense, it's as old as the hills found in ancient empires and feudal societies, hence long before the advent of capitalism. And that's doubtless why it is often deemed residual, an archaic vestige of pre-capitalist society destined to fade away as capitalism matures. And yet it doesn't. We find it even now in prisons, brothels, sweatshops, plantations, slaughterhouses, mines, favelas, and industries that employ migrants, especially migrants without papers. The question is why? Why does this persist in our supposedly modern, technologically advanced society? My answer is that expropriated labor has a structural basis in capitalism. Although it is usually seen as the antithesis of exploited labor, it's better understood as one of the latter's enabling conditions. The reasons are both economic and political. Expropriated labor is cheap precisely because it's extracted from subjugated populations who've been forcibly deprived of political protections and actionable rights. So insofar as they are unable to command a wage that covers their living costs, these workers supply a so-called productive input for whose reproduction capital pays little or nothing. And firms benefit in several ways: by utilizing dependent labor directly in commodity production, by gaining access to cheap energy and raw materials produced by unfree labor elsewhere, by the availability of cheap means of subsistence produced in sweatshops and encomiendas, which of course lowers living costs and therefore wages for all. By expropriating labor for unfree subjects, in other words, capitalists can more profitably exploit free workers. It has been said that behind Manchester stood Mississippi. That's Du Bois's point. What was true in Du Bois's time remains true in ours. Behind Cupertino stands Shenzhen, and behind Shenzhen, Kinshasa. Behind those who shop at Walmart stand those who sew in Dhaka. As Du Bois maintained, moreover, the distinction between free and dependent labor corresponds to the global color line. Who else are the expropriated today but that dark and vast sea of human labor on whose bent and broken backs rests modern industry? This too is not accidental. By dividing free from unfree labor, the system also constitutes two distinct categories of persons, one suitable for mere exploitation, the other destined for brute expropriation. Epidermalizing that distinction, it inscribes race as a structural fault line in capitalist society, implanting within it a host of structural injustices: racial oppression, imperialism, settler colonial apartheid, indigenous dispossession, and genocide. The common thread here is political exposure, the incapacity to set limits and invoke protections, that is the forcibly implanted incapacity, right? Exposure is, in my view, the deepest meaning of expropriability, the thing that sets it apart from exploitability. And it is expropriability, that is the condition of being relatively defenseless and liable to violation, that constitutes the core of racial imperial oppression. What distinguishes free subjects of exploitation from dependent subjects of expropriation is the mark of race as a sign of violability. Once racialized, moreover, expropriated labor is constituted as servile and menial, degraded animal toil, inferior to work that is merely exploited. However bad the latter is, and it often is, the former is and must be worse. Assigned to subject people and performed in subpar conditions, it is best understood as subwork. The expropriated subwork of racialized others is a necessary background condition, then, for the exploited labor of capitalism's iconic workers. Now, this Du Boisian inspired account seems right to me as far as it goes, but I'm claiming that it doesn't go far enough. To speak of a single two-tiered division with the system's producing classes misses a crucial point. Those two tiers depend on and are imbricated with a third, which I've called domesticated labor. Now, I use that term in order to signal the historical and indeed ideological association of this labor with residential familial spaces set apart from factories and offices and formed as complements to the latter. But this work is not performed exclusively within private households, nor is it always unpaid. Rather, domesticated labor includes people nurturing and community sustaining work of many sorts, both unpaid and underpaid, and performed in a variety of different settings, from private homes, neighborhoods and villages, to public agencies, civil society associations, and for-profit firms. In other words, when I say domesticated, I do not mean domestic. To call this work domesticated is rather to say that it has been tamed, historically constituted as a form of shadow work, the devalorized reproductive other of so-called productive labor. Now, to see why, let's again distinguish the generic content of this work from its historical form in capitalism. The generic content includes birthing and socializing the young, caring for the old and infirm, maintaining households, and building communities. In capitalist societies, however, that content is hijacked, reformed, or rather deformed, to serve another function, and that is to produce and replenish the populations whose labor power capital exploits and expropriates. The effect is to domesticate these activities, to form them as what are sometimes called free gifts devoid of so-called value, exchange value. Stamped as non-work, they become the simple expression of maternal feeling or feminine instinct, merely natural, devoid of intelligence, creativity, and skill. As a result, domesticated labor, too, becomes cheap. Treated by capital like a so-called natural resource, it is simply there for the taking by firms that needn't bother to replenish what they take or repair what they damage. And here, too, capital obtains an essential condition for its so-called self-expansion, well below cost. Moreover, capitalism's signature separation of productive from reproductive labor implants gender division deep within it, much as its constitutive separation of exploited from expropriated labor implants race. The effect is to entrench gender binarism. This binarism affects everyone, women and men, cis and trans, gay, straight, and queer, while casting non-cis, non-straight, non-binary people as anomalous, beyond the pale. In addition, capitalism splinters domesticated labor internally. The system, as noted, needs more than one kind of labor power, not just exploitable, but also expropriable. Domesticated labor produces both types, as well as itself, but in different ways. When devoted to replenishing exploitable citizen workers and professional managerial strata, it's performed in part in households by relatives, neighbors, friends, and underpaid domestic workers, but also in social state institutions by professional or semi-professional public employees, social workers, teachers, nurses, and the like, and in for-profit firms by low-paid, racialized sub-workers, private nursing homes, and so on. Things look different, however, when domesticated labor is devoted to sustaining expropriable others. In that case, it's performed in slave quarters and migrant work camps, in ghettos and on reservations, in internment and refugee camps, in favelas and open-air prisons. Doubly disavowed, that labor is tucked away out of sight, the shadow of a shadow. Yet it too is socially necessary. Insofar as capital requires racialized sub-work, it also requires gendered, racialized sub-care work. Now, in its cheapness, domesticated labor has something in common with expropriated labor, but the two types of shadow work differ. One form is stigmatized via race, while the other is sentimentalized via gender. Subwork is bestialized and degraded, toil unbefitting a human being, which is why it is looked away from and kept at a distance. Care work is up close and personal, viewed through the lens of love or natural instinct instead of through that of labor. It's romanticized in theory and dishonored in practice. Thus, the traits associated with each set of workers are not the same. Care workers should be creatures of feeling, exquisitely sensitive to others' needs, which of course they should prioritize over their own. Sub-workers should be thick-skinned, dumb beasts of burden who can take punches and endure pain. In effect, the first are expected to be hyper-affective, while the second must be affect-deprived. And so the two groups of shadow workers are differently constructed. Those among them whom the system finds no use for do not belong to one and the same reserve army of labor. For some, however, as I've already implied, the two forms of shadow work overlap for reasons that, as I said, are not accidental. Repeating, insofar as capitalist society requires degraded subwork, it also requires degraded care work to produce the latter. So here we have a nasty amalgam of care work and subwork that is constituted as sub-care work. And those who perform it are expected to combine traits associated with both. Like care workers, they should be finely attuned to the needs of those they care for, and like sub-workers, they should be thick-skinned, inured to callous disregard of their own needs by bosses, masters, and impersonal powers like banks and international monetary institutions. Here, in the capitalist organization of labor, we see the social basis of one type of intersectionality, which has been insightfully discussed by feminists of color. But there are also others. Consider the historical trajectory of that stratum of majority ethnicity male proletarians in the capitalist core. These are people who were once dispossessed, driven to work in capitalist factories and mines for wages that did not at first cover their living costs, and they enjoyed very few actionable rights. In effect, they were constituted at the outset of the industrial era as hybrids, whose exploitation was overlaid with expropriation. It was only through decades of concerted struggle that some of them succeeded in ridding themselves of overt markers of expropriation, and so in advancing to pure exploitation. But of course, that achievement proves fragile, easily subject to reversal. Today, certainly, many formerly privileged workers have been dragged back into expropriation thanks to neoliberal offshoring, financialization, flexibilization, and union busting. Now, something analogous, just other forms of intersectionality, so to speak, holds for the female counterparts of that stratum, because they too, at the dawn of industrialism, were at first drawn into brutal industrial work, simultaneously exploited and expropriated, but not at first at all domesticated. It was only later, after much struggle, culminating in the victory for a family wage, that some of them ascended to the so-called privilege of housewifery. But they too today are losing that privilege, or have lost that privilege, thanks to neoliberalization and the construction now of the so-called dual earner family. There's finally another form of intersectionality, the trajectory of that stratum of racialized men who moved into the hybrid status that their lighter hued counterparts had vacated when they became, Fordist unionized workers earning something close to a family wage. When those people left the hybrid status and became purely exploited, their place was taken by a stratum of racialized men who were employed in factories, but in dirtier jobs at lower pay, and were still subject, of course, to violation by police and racist mobs. So they become the hybrids, exploited and expropriated simultaneously. These are just a few of the many labor-based intersections that animate capitalism's history. All of them, I'm claiming, arise from combinations of the three faces of capitalist labor. The latter are the building blocks from which such amalgams and hybrids are fabricated. They constitute the hidden intersectional ties among gender, race, and class. The key point is that these categorizations are systemic, as are the faces of labor to which they are tied. Race and gender divides have structural bases in capitalist societies, as does empire and, of course, class. Each member of the famous race-class-gender triad derives its social meaning and political force from its imbrication with the others. All three are co-constituted within one social system, which forms the three faces of labor and deforms the three sets of workers. Conventional understandings of the working class are therefore misleading. Analytically speaking, race and gender are not alternatives to class, but structurally grounded divisions within it. And struggles against gender and racial oppression can plausibly be understood, in Du Bois' sense, as unrecognized or not fully recognized labor struggles. Much more needs to be said about the three faces of labor, their various intersections, and the forms of social struggle to which they give rise, including struggles over who counts as a worker. We need to account for both the functional integration and the political misrecognition that has historically divided the three types of workers, right? Allowed some to go unrecognized as workers. We also need to think about whether the current conjuncture affords some possibilities for overcoming those forms of misrecognition as the boundaries among the three types of labor are blurring in the sense that no longer so much performed by strictly demarcated, dedicated populations. More and more of us are doing more than one of these forms of labor. Anyway, we also need to determine whether and how far the labor lens I'm proposing here can actually embrace and clarify struggles that may seem at first glance to elude it. Struggles against indigenous dispossession, police violence, settler colonial apartheid, murder by debt, against abortion restrictions, gender binarism and sexual assault, against planetary heating, imperial war, forced and blocked migration. All of that is grist for future work and future discussions. Still, I hope I've said enough today to convince you that Du Bois was onto something important. Capitalist society relies on more than one face of labor and precipitates more than one type of labor movement. That perspective has since been enriched, and we have to say complicated, by feminist analyses of gendered care work and social reproduction. By combining their insights with those of Du Bois, I've suggested that capitalist societies give rise for non-accidental reasons to a system-specific nexus of not two, but three faces of labor. Again, analytically distinct, but functionally imbricated, internally related, and mutually co-constituted. The effect is to uncover some hidden ties among gender, race, and class, and therefore to deepen the conceptual force of the term intersectionality and to advance its political project. That project, at least as I understand it, is to build a counter-hegemonic political bloc that embraces the concerns of these three labor movements and that fosters greater coordination among them. Nothing less will suffice to transform the social system that oppresses us all. Now, at the start of this lecture, I posed these rhetorical questions. Why make the concept of labor the starting point for rethinking the gender, race, class triad? Isn't that focus tied to a perspective that prioritizes class over gender and race? Doesn't it risk losing the hard-won insights of feminists and critical race theorists? Won't it take us back to the same discredited paradigm we've worked so hard to dislodge? I hope that I've said enough to convince you that the answer is no, or at least not necessarily. Sometimes it's necessary to risk the appearance of going back in order to go forward. Certainly, the proliferation of group-specific movements and paradigms delivered real insights, but it also encouraged separatism, fragmentation, and siloization. The question we have to ask now is whether we can resituate those insights in a broader perspective that integrates them with one another and with other equally necessary insights. Have feminists and anti-racists reached a level of political maturity that allows us to relinquish the defensive postures we've grown used to in favor of the sorts of offensive ones our times demand? Are trade unionists reeling from the return of expropriation, finally now able to see that the fates of exploited workers are tied to those of the expropriated and the domesticated? Can all of us grasp the severity and scale of the present crisis and rise to meet it by risking a broader engagement? Can we now make a reality of Du Bois's dream? Can we build an inclusive global pro-working class front that embraces the concerns of three labor movements and fosters their cooperation? I don't know the answer, obviously, although I certainly hope it is yes, and I hope that these reflections have contributed in some small way to clarifying what is at stake. Thanks very much for your attention.